Here, new episode of Soloing Secrets, and this is a huge one, Eddie Van Halen. And I have to admit, I've been waiting to put this lesson together. I wanted to feature other guitarists and kind of exhaust some of my other ideas before I finally hit the mighty Edward Van Halen. Definitely, I've admitted this before. Eddie's the entire reason I'm sitting here with a guitar in my lap. He was my initial inspiration and influence back when I was a 12-year-old kid. And I've carried that with me the entire time. So yes, I've studied different styles of music, went to music school at AIM, and I've written books and, lessons for magazines and stuff like that, websites, played with various bands, taught, hundreds if not thousands of students over the years. But Eddie has been there with me. The spirit of Van Halen, the spirit of Eddie Van Halen, regardless. I mean, I could be working on jazz, and there's still a little part of me that still kind of falls back on Eddie's influence. Maybe I'm using a phaser, or maybe I started tapping or something, and it's because of him, definitely. And, we're coming up on 5 years now since he's been gone. I can't believe 5 years have already, gone by. But, sorely missed. I've been thinking about Eddie, listening to his music. I've been rereading, magazine interviews and stuff. Absolutely a huge influence on me, and I know a lot of viewers out there too. Eddie was the man, for sure. So just like we've done in other episodes in the Soloing Secrets series, when you're checking out a certain player like Edward Van Halen, it would be really wise to scope out his musical influences, which will reveal certain things that pop up in his music and his playing style. And there's a ton of players. Some of these we've looked at before, Clapton and Hendrix and people like that. Don't forget his surf guitar influences, the Ventures and Dick Dale and people like that. Alan Holdsworth, Snuffy Walden. There's a ton of musicians that inspired Eddie for sure. And here's a partial list of some of his influences right here. And then as far as some of the people that Eddie worked with in his lifetime and career, obviously the band Van Halen, with different vocalists, and eventually, Michael left and Wolfgang stepped in. But, aside from Van Halen, I did rant about, the secret music of Eddie Van Halen in a rant episode. I guess that was, several months ago. It was earlier this year. And we looked at some of his session appearances, guest appearances, Brian May, the Starfleet project and some of that, the Big Life soundtrack and stuff. So there actually is a lot more than just Van Halen, albums. But you have to dig for some of this stuff. You have to kind of dig around the Roger Waters song, just various things, Nicolette Larson and stuff like that. But here's some of the people that Eddie worked with in his lifetime and career. And as far as Eddie's actual soloing secrets, the things he would typically do with a guitar in his hands when he was playing a fill or a lick or a riff or a solo, and there's a lot, once again, modified blues phrasing, various pentatonic scales, hybrid pentatonic scales, modal tonalities, either played or implied, obviously tapping, dive bombs, harmonics, effects, all kinds of stuff, volume swells, tons of stuff. And this is just a partial list, but definitely, we have looked at some Eddie Van Halen techniques and ideas before. We've looked at symmetrical scales and harmonics and some various things, in other lessons and videos on the channel here. So I am going to focus on some different parts of Eddie's, soloing style, lead style, single string scales and tapping, arpeggios and scales and stuff like that. But here's Eddie's elusive soloing secrets right here. So as far as the music and ideas that I'm sharing in this lesson, I basically pulled ideas from 4 Van Halen related albums, and I'm kind of serving up, very specific things. And I mentioned this just a second ago, the single string scales. That's something that appears a lot in Eddie's music, whether he's tapping or tremolo picking or position shifting or something. sometimes at the end of a song, he would do these lazy, like single string, melodies and riffs and stuff. And just a really different way of approaching the guitar neck scales. Usually you would think across the strings instead of a single string. So we're going to dive into that and some various other things too. But here are the album cover, images where I pulled music and ideas for this lesson right here. So with the opening, that was me playing around with the solo section from the song Big Trouble, and that's from Van Halen's bootleg album, Zero Demos. And those are demos they recorded in 1976 when they were working with Gene Simmons. Keep in mind, that's before Ted Templeman, Warner Brothers, and Van Halen won, so that's why it's called Zero Demos. And there's some interesting moments on this kind of bootleg album. Early versions of songs that they would record later, like House of Pain, and there's Somebody Get Me a Doctor in some of those songs. And it's really interesting. So if you haven't checked this out, you can find it out here on YouTube. You can find it online to listen to. And I'm trying to track down like a bootleg vinyl copy, which those are floating around out there too. I think I've seen them for like 25, maybe $30. But here's the Zero Demos, kind of front cover and back cover right here. And as far as the solo from Big Trouble, this is one of my favorite Van Halen solos, and it's from an unreleased bootleg, where it's like, man, this is such a cool solo, like this. Something like that. So we're starting with this riff. It actually starts in E, just does like the E riff over and over. And then there's a progression right there. And notice this chord progression, because we're going to target it during the lead when Eddie starts soloing. But it's moving from that E octave to a C octave to a G octave to a B. There's a big slide right there. And then that G to B, and then put a big slide after that B. Something like that. And then when Eddie starts his lead, he's sneaking in right there, and it's like a little part of E minor, right? Like an E minor, part of an E minor triad. Just think of D minor up a whole step right there. And he's kind of, targeting E over that E octave. So he's kind of sliding into that B note, E, B, G. And then after that G, grab that E. And then keep in mind it's moving to C, right? And he does this. And that's so crafty, that G to F sharp to G, and then he's targeting that C. And then it's moving to a G octave, right? And he starts doing that bluesy kind of bending leg. And then it's moving to a B, and he's basically targeting like a little part of B major right there, that B flat to B to that D sharp. So just that opening, section from that solo is so cool. And Eddie was 20 years old when he recorded this, and he's targeting the chord progression like an expert right there. Right? So after that, then you hear him shift like way out of position, and he's moving into the box right here. So he's kind of moving into this A note, and he's bending it up to B, and then grab that high E. And then he basically bends that D to E twice and grabs that fretted E. And then this gets kind of funky, because he's doing that C, B, A, G like over and over, but he's doing this kind of muted, like percussive kind of thing in the middle. And the last last time just hang on that G with vibrato. Then you hear him slide out of nowhere and he's moving into this hammer-on, you know, kind of sextuplet thing. So right there, I'm starting somewhere around that G note right there. You know, loosely, but I'm starting right about there with the slide. And you're moving into that D, E, F sharp, G, A, B right there. And you're gonna do that sextuplet like 3 times in a row with hammer-ons. Like that. And then, so that G, A, G, and then that F sharp to D. So, and then a little melody in there. And then you hear him milk this F sharp bend up a half step to G. Goes back to that E note, and then he bends that note again, that F sharp up to G and back. And it sounds like he's strangling his guitar. It's very expressive right there on that bend. And I just kind of ended it with that little part of E blues. It's kind of hard to make out how he ends it because you hear him slide it off and he goes back into that octave riff. So I ended at something like that. That's kind of what it sounds like. And it goes back to the... If you haven't heard Big Trouble, which I realized David Lee Roth released a song called Big Trouble on Eat 'Em and Smile with Steve Vai on guitar, that's a totally different song. Van Halen's Big Trouble eventually became known as Big River on A Different Kind of Truth, but the demo version on Zero Demos just rocks out. Eddie's solo's different, the groove's different. That song kicks ass. Okay, next up we're going to basically attack Eddie's single string arpeggios and scales in this lesson pretty hard. And we haven't really looked at this before, you know, like this. And there's lots of examples, you know, I can kind of draw from, but one that I remember I heard early on, and I was like, hey, I think I know what that is. Like the opening tapping lick from Spanish Fly from Van Halen 2. This is after the tapped, you know, harmonic section that was chord-based, but this part. When I was a kid, I heard that and I almost recognized it, like, hey, I think I know what that is, even though I didn't really understand what Eddie was doing, but just listening to it, I kind of recognized the sound, especially that last part. I remember sitting there in my room like, hey, I think I know what that is. You know, I was like, hey, I know that scale. And then eventually I learned that he was tapping it right there instead of fretting it like the A blues scale, right? But that's just like a really big breakthrough for me early on to realize like, hey, he's tapping a scale that I already know how to play regular, and then I had to learn how to tap it. So right there, like for that Spanish Fly lick, he's basically using, you know, like the A minor pentatonic scale right there. He's tapping G, he's got that C and D with the open G. And then the same thing on the D string right there. Tapping that D, he's got an A and a G fretted with the open D string. And then he literally kind of cruises down, you know, the A blues scale there, tapping A, and then that E, E flat, D to C. Like that. And right there, just think of an A minor blues scale on the A string, and you can see what he's doing right there. Think of this. But, right, the same thing. Now also keep in mind, you can move that to other strings. Move it to the low E, now it's an E blues scale, right? There it is in A. Here it is in D. There it is in G. There it is in B. And there it is on the high E. Right? So you can kind of use that and move it into other keys, move it to other strings, and obviously it's going to sound different. But all of that thinking kind of stemmed just from learning that tapping lick from Spanish Fly right there. Okay, next up we're going to take a look at some of Eddie's single string arpeggios, and this is something he did his entire career, especially when he was tapping. And for this, we're going to basically identify some arpeggios but perform them in the Van Halen style. So let's start with A minor. So the 3 notes we need for an A minor arpeggio are A, C, E. which of course spells the word ace, which I'm sure Ace Frehley back there is really happy about that. But for this, let's put it on the A string, the open A, fretted C, fretted E, and a tapped A right there, and there's A minor. Right? Take that C, move it to C sharp, that's our third. So we're moving from A minor to A major when we do that. Now we've got A, C sharp, E, and a tapped A. Right? So A minor, A major. Take that, move it up a half step. Now you've got D, F, and A, and that's D minor right there with the open A string too. Take that F, move it to F sharp. Now it's D major with D, F sharp, A, and the open A string. So right there, A minor, A major, D major, like that. And then right there, we could actually move up again, D sharp, F sharp, and start tapping that B note with the open A, and that's B7 implied. You know, something like that. So that was all on the A string. A minor, A major, D minor, D major, and then also ending on that B7 implied. And just like the B blues or the A blues scale that we just looked at from Spanish Fly with the descending, right? And we kind of moved that to all 6 strings. You could do that with this on all 6 strings. There's the low E. Right? We already did the A string. Let's do it on the D string. The G string. Right. We can move it to any string, really. There's the B string. So the important thing there is you're learning one idea and then fleshing it out on all 6 strings just to see what it feels like, what it sounds like, and definitely that's something Eddie would do. So here's another moment of Eddie's single string scale action. This takes place during Ain't Talkin Bout Love from Van Halen 1, and when I was a kid, I remember I picked this out and I was like, hey, I think I know what that is. It's this fill right here. Right? Really basic stuff. And he's really just shifting on a single string and also doing some bar dips in there. And when I heard that, I was like, hey. I was like, hey, I know that scale. Right? A minor pentatonic right there, but on the G string. Right? And he's really just starting on C and then ending on that G. So he's avoiding the A root notes, but that's kind of a secret, you know, Van Halen lick. It's like, hey, that's A minor pentatonic like this. So Eddie was definitely well known for tapping single string scales and arpeggios, also sliding them with bar dips, and then occasionally he would also tremolo pick a series of notes on a single string and kind of flesh out a scale. Here's a tremolo picking single string lick from Hot for Teacher solo from 1984, like this. One more time. Something like that. So this is basically A major. He's starting on this B and he's bending that to C sharp. And then as far as the tremolo picking, this is an area that definitely Eddie would use a lot. You can hear it in Eruption and obviously in Hot for Teacher and tons of other songs. And that's rapidly picking the same notes or the series of notes on a single string. And you're literally doing tremolo like a classical guitarist or flamenco guitarist would do, but you're doing it with a pick on the guitar like that. So bend that B to C sharp, and then you're going to literally tremolo pick that B note. Right? And when I tremolo pick, my picking hand goes into a totally different position than normal because I'm really kind of exerting my hand in a totally different way. And it's the only time my hand really goes in this position. I've also noticed that I keep the same tremolo picking technique that I've had since I was a kid. So I never really kind of reformatted or redeveloped this technique. I've just always kind of done it the same way. My hand goes in this weird kind of thing. Eddie, if you watch footage of Eddie doing it, I mean, he would literally fly above the strings like this. And I don't understand how he did that without muting. Because when I tried to do that, I just hit all the strings, adjacent. And it's real noisy if I do it like that. So I do it like this. And I can feel like my forearms kind of tensed up a little bit, definitely very different than my normal playing style. And like I said, you're literally tremolo picking B, C sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, and A. And I would just start real slow and then just decide, like, am I doing 3 or 6 or 12, or maybe you're doing 16th notes like 4 or 8 or something like that. But just move real slow. And he definitely starts picking like the lower notes more than the higher notes. And he's kind of targeting that final A there at the end. But keep in mind, that's literally A major performed on the G string, starting on that bent B, and then B, C sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp to A, right there. Hot for teacher. Last but not least is an ending lick that Eddie played in the song Ice Cream Man from the first Van Halen album, and there's actually 3 examples of this type of single string scale ending from Eddie on that first album. You can hear it in Ice Cream Man, you can also hear it in I'm the One at the end, and also at the ending of You Really Got Me, their Kinks cover. You can hear this kind of lazy single string scale action from Eddie. And in Ice Cream Man, at the very end of the song, the last thing you hear is this. Like that, one more time. Something like that. So keep in mind, Ice Cream Man's in the key of E, right? And this like partial scale is going to sound like A major, kind of. But we're not in A. We're in E for this. So against E, that A major scale is going to sound like E mixolydian. Definitely Eddie loved using mixolydian a lot, that flat 7 sound. So when you hear that, he's starting F sharp, E, back to that D, back to that B note there. Right? And then he hikes all the way up, grabs this A to that G sharp, and then this E down to that D. And he starts very gradually bending that D up to E, and then just end with an E9 like the funk chord. So really slow he's doing. And then, and you grab that E9 and slide it off. Something like that. And it's really interesting to notice like what he used of that E mixolydian scale right there. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of Soloing Secrets with this look at Eddie Van Halen. Definitely a mighty guitarist, very influential, for me. I know a lot of the viewers out there are huge Van Halen fans too. And I miss Eddie. I've been thinking about him ever since, he passed away. Obviously, I've been thinking about him ever since I was a 12-year-old kid, off and on. But, there's so much wrapped up in his musical legacy and his musical world. I could make a lesson like this for an hour just focusing on his string bending. There's like so much to decode and define and explore in Eddie's music and in his musical world. And this single string scale, kind of approach, it's interesting. It's also eye-opening, fretboard expanding. It's going to kind of make you think about things a little differently instead of running across the strings like in some different ways. Finding some ways to kind of fly up and down a single string like that's really interesting and inspiring. And like I said, there's so much in Eddie's universe and his legacy that you could kind of focus on and decode or define. That's kind of what I chose to do for this lesson. Like, yeah, let's look at those single string arpeggios and scales and tapping and bar dipping and tremolo picking and stuff. And I don't know, there's just something about Eddie, the magic, the way he played guitar, his tone, his feel, the touch, the techniques, the neat noises and all that stuff. There's so much there. And plus, he was just a cool guy. You know, he was definitely almost like a greasy guitar guy, you know, and like he was breaking guitars apart and painting them and upgrading them and, you know, just like tossing them around and stuff like that. So that's really interesting. Also, that side of his legacy and everything is really inspiring. Just the way he would kind of tinker with things and dial in tone or dial in, you know, like the setting or something or the setup on his guitar and stuff. That's really, you know, inspiring for everybody out there. You know, maybe if you can't play guitar like Van Halen, you can borrow some of those kind of, you know, innovative ideas for, you know, creating different, you know, guitar parts or guitar effects or whatever. I mean, across the board, Eddie was the man and very inspiring. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you. And rest in peace, Edward Van Halen.